The morning sun caught the diamonds just right as Queen Camilla descended the palace stairs, each facet throwing tiny rainbows across the cream-colored walls. But it wasn't the beauty of the jewelry that made Lady Margaret freeze mid-step in the corridor, her coffee cup trembling in her hands. It was the recognition. That particular arrangement of sapphires and diamonds, the way they caught the light, the distinctive Georgian setting that had been photographed 1,000 times around another woman's neck. Kate's necklace, the one that had belonged to Princess Diana, the one that had never, ever been worn by anyone except the Princess of Wales. Within minutes, whispers would ripple through the palace like wildfire. Within hours, the story would reach the highest levels of the royal household. And within days, it would threaten to unravel decades of carefully maintained royal protocol and family harmony. But in that moment, as Camilla walked unknowingly toward the breakfast room where King Charles awaited her, adjusting the necklace's clasp with casual confidence, she had no idea that she was about to trigger the biggest internal royal crisis in years. She had no idea that her husband would notice immediately, and she certainly had no idea that her simple choice of jewelry that morning would expose secrets, rivalries, and power struggles that the palace had worked so hard to keep hidden from the world. This is the story of what happened next, told through the eyes of those who witnessed it all unfold behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace. Lady Margaret Ashworth had been working in royal households for 37 years, and she prided herself on maintaining absolute discretion under all circumstances. She had served during scandals, divorces, deaths, and births. She had seen princes throw tantrums, queens weep in private, and kings struggle with decisions that would shape nations. Never once had she broken her composure or forgotten her place. But that Tuesday morning in late October, as she walked through the east corridor of Buckingham Palace carrying the Queen's morning tea service, Margaret stopped so abruptly that the fine bone china rattled against the silver tray. Her eyes fixed on the figure approaching from the other end of the hallway, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades of royal service, Lady Margaret felt her professional mask slip entirely. Queen Camilla moved with her usual unhurried elegance, her pearl gray morning dress perfectly pressed, her hair styled in the soft waves that had become her signature. She was speaking quietly into her phone, likely confirming arrangements for the children's charity visit scheduled for that afternoon. Everything about her appearance was exactly as it should be, except for one glaring, impossible detail. Around her neck hung a necklace that Margaret had seen countless times in photographs, in portraits, and in person during formal occasions. The sapphires were unmistakable, deep blue stones that seemed to hold the ocean within their depths, surrounded by diamonds that formed delicate flower patterns. It was the Queen Alexandra's wedding necklace, a piece that had been in the royal collection for over a century. But that wasn't what made Margaret's hands shake. What made her struggle to breathe was the knowledge that this particular necklace had been designated specifically for the Princess of Wales. It had been Diana's signature piece, worn to countless state dinners and formal events. After Diana's death, it had been carefully preserved, eventually becoming one of Catherine's most cherished pieces from the royal collection. Every member of the palace staff knew the protocol surrounding Diana's jewelry. They knew which pieces belonged to whom, which could be shared, and which were absolutely off-limits. The Queen Alexandra necklace was definitely off-limits to anyone except the Princess of Wales. Margaret pressed herself against the wall as Queen Camilla approached, offering a respectful bow as always. Camilla smiled warmly and nodded, continuing her phone conversation as she passed. Margaret waited until the Queen had turned the corner before she allowed herself to lean against the wall, her heart pounding. She needed to think. More importantly, she needed to understand how this had happened. Margaret knew the palace systems better than almost anyone. The crown jewels were kept in the Tower of London, but the personal jewelry collection was housed in a secure vault deep within Buckingham Palace. Access was strictly controlled, with detailed logs of every piece that was removed and returned. Only a handful of people had the authority to authorize access to pieces designated for specific members of the royal family. Margaret continued toward the Queen's private sitting room, her mind racing. Perhaps there had been some mistake. Perhaps the queen had selected the wrong necklace in error. The jewelry vault contained hundreds of pieces, and, while each was carefully catalogued, mistakes could happen. But, as she knocked on the sitting room door and entered with the tea service, Margaret knew she was grasping at unlikely explanations. Queen Camilla was meticulous about her appearance, and had been carefully taught the protocols surrounding royal jewelry. She would never make such an error accidentally. The sitting room was empty, which wasn't unusual at this hour. Queen Camilla often took her morning calls while walking through the palace. Finding the movement helped her think. Margaret set down the tea service and was about to leave when she noticed something that made her stomach drop even further. On the queen's dressing table, lying open, was the leather-bound journal where all jewelry selections were recorded. Every piece worn by senior royals was noted, along with the occasion and duration of wear. It was a security measure and a historical record, maintained with military precision. Margaret glanced toward the door, ensuring she was alone, then moved closer to the journal. The page was open to today's date, and in Queen Camilla's neat handwriting was an entry that made no sense. Queen Alexandra's wedding necklace. Children's charity visit, Paddington. But below that, in a different hand, someone had added a note. Authorization. HM, followed by what appeared to be King Charles's signature. Margaret stared at the page, trying to process what she was seeing. Had the king himself authorized his wife to wear Catherine's necklace? It seemed impossible. King Charles was acutely aware of the sensitivities surrounding Diana's jewelry. He had been careful, sometimes overly so, about ensuring that Catherine felt comfortable with the pieces she inherited from his first wife. The sound of footsteps in the corridor sent Margaret quickly back to the tea service. She busied herself arranging the cups and saucers, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had discovered. By the time Queen Camilla returned to the sitting room, Margaret had composed herself enough to perform her duties normally. "Thank you, Margaret," Queen Camilla said, settling into her favorite chair by the window. "Could you please confirm that my car will be ready at 2:30 for the Paddington visit?" "Of course, Your Majesty," Margaret replied, proud that her voice remained steady. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the necklace again in the morning light streaming through the windows. The sapphires seemed to glow with an inner fire, and Margaret was suddenly struck by how perfectly they complemented Queen Camilla's coloring. But that only made the situation more troubling. If the necklace looked so beautiful on Queen Camilla, if it suited her so perfectly, how would Catherine feel when she learned about it? As Margaret walked back through the corridors toward the staff quarters, she found herself torn between duty and concern. Her loyalty to the royal family was absolute, but part of that loyalty meant protecting them from situations that could damage their relationships or their public standing. The sight of Queen Camilla wearing Catherine's necklace had the potential to do both. She decided to speak with Mrs. Henderson, the head of housekeeping staff, who had been with the royal household even longer than Margaret. If anyone would know how to handle this delicate situation, it would be Mrs. Henderson. But before Margaret could reach the staff quarters, she encountered James Morrison, the king's private secretary, hurrying through the corridor with an expression of barely controlled panic. James had served the royal family for 15 years and was known for his unflappable demeanor. To see him looking rattled was deeply unsettling. "James," Margaret called softly. He stopped and turned, and she could see the stress lines around his eyes. "Margaret, thank God," he said, lowering his voice. "Have you seen the Queen this morning? I need to speak with her urgently." "She's in her sitting room, taking her morning tea," Margaret replied. "Is everything all right?" James glanced around the corridor, ensuring they were alone. "The Princess of Wales called 20 minutes ago. She's planning to wear the Queen Alexandra necklace to the state dinner tomorrow night. She specifically requested that it be cleaned and prepared." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "I see," she managed to say. "The problem is," James continued, "when I went to retrieve it from the vault, I was told it had been signed out yesterday evening. The log shows it was authorized by His Majesty for the Queen's use." The two staff members looked at each other in silence, both understanding the implications. In a few hours, When Catherine arrived at the palace for her afternoon appointments, she would expect to see her necklace waiting for her. Instead, she would learn that it was currently around Queen Camilla's neck, apparently with her father-in-law's blessing. "What do you think happened?" Margaret asked quietly. James shook his head. "I have no idea. The king was in meetings until nearly midnight last night. When would he have had time to authorize this? And why would he? He knows how important Diana's jewelry is to Catherine." Margaret thought about what she had seen in Queen Camilla's jewelry journal. The signature that looked like the king's, but somehow didn't feel quite right. "James, who else has access to the jewelry vault? Besides the king and queen?" "Just myself, Mrs. Thompson from security, and Lady Pemberton. But none of us would authorize something like this without explicit instructions." "And the queen herself?" James paused, considering. "Well, yes. As queen, she has access to the entire collection. But she's always been scrupulous about following protocols, especially regarding pieces that belong to Diana." They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, both grappling with the possibility that Queen Camilla might have deliberately taken Catherine's necklace. It seemed unthinkable, but what other explanation could there be? "I need to speak with the king," James said finally. "This has to be resolved before the Princess of Wales arrives this afternoon." Margaret nodded. "And I should probably warn Mrs. Henderson. If this becomes a family matter, we'll need to ensure the staff are prepared." As they parted ways, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of a crisis that would reshape the dynamics of the royal family. The morning had started so normally, with the usual routines and protocols that govern palace life. But now, because of one piece of jewelry, everything felt uncertain. She thought about Queen Camilla's expression as she had walked through the corridor earlier. There had been something different about her demeanor, a confidence that seemed almost defiant. Had she worn the necklace knowing it would cause problems? Was this some kind of statement, a way of asserting her position within the family hierarchy? Margaret had always admired Queen Camilla's grace under pressure, her ability to fulfill her duties despite years of public scrutiny and criticism. But this felt different. This felt like a deliberate provocation, and Margaret couldn't understand why the queen would risk damaging her relationship with Catherine over a piece of jewelry, no matter how beautiful. As she finally reached the staff quarters, Margaret realized that within a few hours, everyone in the palace would know about the necklace situation. Royal households were notorious for their gossip networks, and news of this magnitude would spread quickly. By evening, the story would likely have reached other royal residences, and by the next day, it might even make its way to the press. The thought of newspaper headlines speculating about rifts between Queen Camilla and the Princess of Wales made Margaret's stomach churn. The royal family had worked so hard to present a united front, to show the public that the wounds of the past had healed. If this situation wasn't handled carefully, it could undo years of careful relationship building. But as Margaret knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door, she realized that the potential for public embarrassment might be the least of their worries. The real concern was what this would do to the family itself, to the trust and respect that they had worked so hard to build between themselves. In a few hours, King Charles would have to choose between supporting his wife's decision and protecting his daughter-in-law's feelings. Catherine would have to decide how to respond to what might be seen as a deliberate slight, and Queen Camilla would have to explain her actions to a family that had already endured more than their share of jewelry-related controversies. As Margaret prepared to share what she had witnessed with Mrs. Henderson, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end of the carefully maintained peace within the royal family. The morning sun that had made Queen Camilla's necklace sparkle so brilliantly might also have illuminated the cracks in the foundation of the monarchy itself. King Charles sat in his private study, staring at the morning newspapers spread across his mahogany desk, but his eyes weren't processing the words. His mind was consumed by the phone call he had received 20 minutes earlier from his private secretary, James Morrison. The words kept echoing in his head. "Your Majesty, there appears to be a situation with the Queen Alexandra necklace." Charles had been king for less than 2 years, but he had spent 7 decades preparing for the role. He understood the weight of every decision, the ripple effects of every action taken by members of the royal family. He had seen how jewelry controversies could spiral into constitutional crises, how personal family disputes could become front-page news that damaged the monarchy's reputation for generations. But this situation felt different. This wasn't about protocol violations or security breaches. This was about his wife and his daughter-in-law, two women he loved and respected, and a piece of jewelry that carried the weight of history, memory, and profound personal significance. The irony wasn't lost on him that the necklace at the center of this crisis had been Diana's favorite. He remembered buying it for her early in their marriage, how her eyes had lit up when she first saw the sapphires that matched her engagement ring. He remembered how beautiful she had looked wearing it to their first state dinner as a married couple, how proud he had felt to see her representing the crown with such grace and elegance. After Diana's death, the necklace had sat in the vault for years. Charles couldn't bear to see it, couldn't bear to think about the memories it held. When William had married Catherine, Charles had been relieved to see the necklace find new purpose, to see it bring joy instead of pain. Catherine had worn it with such dignity, such understanding of its significance. She had never treated it as merely another piece of jewelry, but as a connection to the mother-in-law she had never met. So how had it ended up around Camilla's neck? Charles reached for his secure phone and dialed his wife's personal number. It rang several times before Camilla answered, her voice bright and cheerful. "Charles, darling, I'm just about to leave for Paddington. The car should be here any moment. Camilla, I need to speak with you about something urgent. Could you come to my study?" There was a pause, and Charles could hear the subtle shift in his wife's tone. "Of course. Is everything all right? I prefer to discuss it in person." Charles hung up and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. The autumn leaves were falling in gentle spirals, and he found himself thinking about cycles, about how the past always seemed to circle back to complicate the present. He had worked so hard to build harmony within his family. After decades of public scrutiny, failed relationships, and personal struggles, he had finally found stability with Camilla. Their marriage had been controversial, but they had weathered the criticism together, slowly winning public acceptance through dedicated service and genuine affection for each other. Similarly, his relationship with William and Catherine had evolved from the awkwardness of his second marriage to something approaching genuine warmth. Catherine had been particularly gracious, never making Charles feel guilty about the past, always treating Camilla with kindness and respect. The family had achieved a delicate balance, a peaceful coexistence that allowed them to function effectively as representatives of the crown. But jewelry had always been a potential minefield. Charles knew the power that these pieces held, not just as symbols of wealth and status, but as repositories of memory and emotion. Diana's jewelry was particularly sensitive, carrying the weight of a love story that had captivated the world and a tragedy that had broken millions of hearts. When he had given certain pieces to Catherine, Charles had done so with careful consideration. He had consulted with William, had made sure Catherine felt comfortable with the responsibility, had even spoken privately with his sons about which pieces should remain exclusively hers. The Queen Alexandra necklace had been explicitly designated for the Princess of Wales, a decision that everyone in the family understood and accepted. So what had changed? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Charles called, turning from the window. Camilla entered the study, and Charles immediately saw the necklace. Even in the muted light of his study, the sapphires seemed to glow, and he was struck by how perfectly they complemented Camilla's complexion. For a moment, he was transported back 30 years to the first time he had seen the necklace, the first time he had placed it around Diana's neck. "You wanted to see me?" Camilla asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. She seemed relaxed, but Charles noticed the slight tension around her eyes, the way her hand unconsciously moved to touch the necklace. "Camilla, I need to ask you about the necklace you're wearing." Her hand stilled, and Charles saw a flicker of something, defensiveness perhaps, cross her features. "It's beautiful, isn't it? I thought it would be perfect for today's engagement." That's Diana's necklace, Camilla. It's been designated for Catherine. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Camilla's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, embarrassment, and then something that looked almost like defiance. I'm aware of its history, Charles, but I'm also aware that I'm queen now. Surely that means I have access to the crown's jewelry collection. Charles felt a chill at his wife's words. This wasn't the Camilla he knew, the woman who had always been sensitive to family dynamics, who had gone out of her way to avoid any appearance of overstepping boundaries. Of course you have access to the collection, Charles said carefully, but certain pieces have specific designations. This necklace was given to Catherine as Princess of Wales. It would be inappropriate for anyone else to wear it without her permission. Camilla stood and walked to the window, her back to Charles. When she spoke, her voice was controlled but tight with emotion. Do you know what it's like, Charles, to always be second? To know that no matter what I do, how hard I work, how dedicated I am to this role, I'll always be compared to a ghost. Charles felt his heart sink. This wasn't about jewelry at all. This was about decades of living in Diana's shadow, about public perception and private insecurities that ran deeper than he had realized. Camilla, you're not second to anyone. You're my wife, your queen, and you've earned your place through years of devoted service. She turned to face him, and Charles was startled to see tears in her eyes. Have I, Charles? Because every time I put on a tiara, someone compares it to how Diana looked. Every time I attend a state dinner, someone writes about how I'll never have her charisma. Every time I try to connect with the public, someone reminds the world that they would have preferred William to skip his father and become king so Catherine could be queen instead. Charles moved to his wife, placing his hands on her shoulders. Those people don't matter, Camilla. What matters is our family, our work, our commitment to each other. But it does matter, Charles. It matters because I'm tired of being treated like a placeholder. I'm tired of having to be grateful for scraps while Diana's memory gets the feast. Charles felt the weight of his wife's pain, but he also recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. So you decided to take her necklace? Camilla's eyes flashed. I decided to wear a piece of jewelry that belongs to the crown. I'm queen, Charles. When do I get to act like it? When it doesn't hurt our family, Charles replied quietly. The words hung between them like a challenge. Charles could see that Camilla understood the implications of what she had done, but he could also see that she wasn't ready to back down. Catherine has dozens of Diana's pieces, Camilla continued. Would it really hurt her so much to share just this once? That's not the point, Camilla, and you know it. This isn't about sharing. This is about respect and protocol and family harmony. Family harmony, Camilla repeated bitterly. You mean keeping the peace so that everyone can continue pretending that I'm accepted, that I belong here? Charles felt a surge of frustration. You do belong here, Camilla. But actions like this make people question your judgment, your respect for tradition. Tradition, Camilla laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. The same tradition that said I could never marry you? The same tradition that made me wait 30 years to be acknowledged? I think I've respected tradition quite enough. Charles realized that this conversation was spiraling beyond the immediate problem of the necklace. This was about years of accumulated resentment, about wounds that he had thought were healed, but were clearly still raw. His phone rang, interrupting the tense moment. Charles glanced at the caller ID and saw James Morrison's name. He let it go to voicemail, but the interruption reminded him of the practical crisis they were facing. Camilla, Catherine is expecting to wear that necklace to tomorrow night's state dinner. James has already had to stall her about getting it cleaned and prepared. Then, perhaps Catherine should choose something else. There are plenty of other options in the collection. Charles stared at his wife in disbelief. You want me to tell Catherine that she can't wear her necklace because you've decided to keep it? I want you to support your wife for once, instead of always deferring to what Diana would have wanted or what Catherine might prefer. The accusation hit Charles like a physical blow. That's not fair, Camilla. Isn't it? She challenged. When was the last time you chose me first, Charles? When was the last time you said, my wife deserves this honor, this recognition, this piece of jewelry that makes her feel beautiful and valued? Charles found himself speechless. He loved Camilla, had fought for their relationship against enormous opposition, had waited decades to marry her. But he also recognized the truth in her words. In his efforts to be fair to everyone, to honor Diana's memory, while building a future with Camilla, he had perhaps been less than fully supportive of his second wife. "I'm going to Paddington now," Camilla said, moving toward the door. "The children are expecting me, and I won't disappoint them because of a family argument about jewelry. Camilla, please. We need to resolve this before it gets any worse." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "The only thing that needs to be resolved, Charles, is whether you're going to stand by your queen or continue to live in the past." After she left, Charles slumped into his chair, feeling every one of his 74 years. The morning had started with routine meetings about trade negotiations and agricultural policy. Now he was facing a family crisis that threatened to expose decades of unresolved tensions. He thought about calling William, but dismissed the idea immediately. His son had enough pressures without being drawn into a conflict between his stepmother and his wife. He considered calling Catherine directly, but that seemed equally problematic. How do you explain to your daughter-in-law that your wife has claimed her necklace as a statement of royal authority? James Morrison knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a liberty that indicated the urgency of the situation. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid the situation is escalating. Word is beginning to spread among the staff, and I've had 3 calls from photographers asking about the Queen's jewelry choices for today's event." Charles felt his stomach drop. How did they find out so quickly? "Social media, sir. Someone posted a photo from the charity visit. The necklace is clearly visible, and people are beginning to recognize it from photos of the Princess of Wales." James handed Charles his tablet, showing a Twitter post with a close-up photo of Camilla speaking to a group of children. The necklace was prominently displayed, and the comments below were already speculating about its significance. "This is a disaster," Charles muttered. "It gets worse, sir. The Princess of Wales has arrived for her afternoon appointments. She's asking about the necklace preparations for tomorrow night." Charles looked at his private secretary, this man who had served the family faithfully for years, who had helped navigate countless crises. "What do you recommend, James?" "Honestly, sir, I think you need to choose sides. Either Queen Camilla returns the necklace and apologizes, or you support her decision and deal with the consequences for the Princess of Wales and Prince William." The stark choice laid out by James crystallized the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just about a necklace anymore. This was about the future dynamics of the royal family, about whether Camilla would be seen as an equal partner or a disruptive force. Charles thought about his wife's pain, her years of patient service, her legitimate desire to be treated with the respect due to a queen. He also thought about Catherine's grace, her dedication to her role, her right to the jewelry that had been explicitly designated for her. But most of all, he thought about the monarchy itself, about the institution he was sworn to protect and pass on to the next generation. Could the crown survive another jewelry scandal? Could the family survive a public rift between the Queen and the Princess of Wales? As Charles sat in his study, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors who had faced their own impossible choices, he realized that his decision in the next few hours would define not just his reign, but the future of the royal family itself. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, and Charles made his choice. Queen Camilla entered the blue drawing room with her chin held high, the contested necklace still gleaming around her neck. She had changed from her morning dress into an elegant navy ensemble, but the sapphires remained, catching the fading afternoon light like captured stars. Her expression was composed, but Catherine could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirt. The 3 most senior members of the royal family stood facing each other in a tableau that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. King Charles, caught between his wife and his daughter-in-law. Catherine, fighting for her position and the respect she had earned. And Camilla, making what might be the most dangerous gamble of her royal career. "I understand there are some concerns about my jewelry choices today," Camilla said, her voice steady, but with an underlying edge that Catherine had never heard before. "Camilla, please sit down," Charles said, gesturing toward the grouping of chairs near the fireplace. "We need to discuss this situation before it causes any more damage." But Camilla remained standing, and Catherine realized that her stepmother-in-law was taking a defensive stance, preparing for battle rather than negotiation. "I think the damage was caused when someone decided that I needed permission to wear jewelry that belongs to the crown," Camilla said, her eyes moving between Charles and Catherine. "I've been queen for 18 months, but apparently I'm still being treated like a guest in my own home." Catherine felt a surge of anger at the implications of Camilla's words. "This isn't about your status as queen, Camilla. This is about respecting family agreements and protocols that we've all followed." "Protocols that were made before I became queen," Camilla countered. "Protocols that assume I should be grateful for whatever scraps are left after everyone else has taken their pick." The bitterness in Camilla's voice shocked Catherine. She had thought their relationship had progressed beyond these kinds of resentments. They had worked together on countless engagements, had shared family celebrations, had seemed to find a comfortable dynamic that worked for everyone. "Camilla, that's not fair," Charles interjected. "You know how much we value your contributions to the family." "Doi." Camilla turned to face her husband directly. "Because from where I stand, it feels like I'm constantly being reminded of my place, constantly being told what I can and cannot do, constantly being measured against a woman who died nearly 30 years ago." The mention of Diana created a heavy silence in the room. Catherine felt the familiar weight of expectations and comparisons that had followed her throughout her marriage to William. But hearing Camilla voice similar frustrations was both surprising and enlightening. "This isn't about Diana," Catherine said quietly. "This is about respect and communication. If you wanted to wear the necklace, you could have asked. If you felt that the current arrangements weren't fair, you could have discussed it with the family. Ask permission?" Camilla's voice rose slightly, though she quickly controlled it. "I'm Queen of England, Catherine. I shouldn't have to ask permission to wear crown jewelry." "Even queens follow protocols," Catherine replied, her own voice sharpening. "Even kings consult with their families about sensitive matters. That's what makes us a family rather than just a collection of titles." Charles moved between the two women, his face reflecting the pain of watching his wife and daughter-in-law in conflict. "Please, both of you. We're not enemies here. We're family, and we need to find a way to resolve this that preserves our relationships." Catherine looked at Charles and realized that he was still hoping for a compromise that would satisfy everyone. But some situations required clear decisions rather than diplomatic solutions. "Charles, let me ask you a direct question," Catherine said. "Do you support your wife's decision to claim my necklace?" The question forced Charles into the corner he had been trying to avoid all day. He looked at Camilla, seeing the woman he loved, the partner who had supported him through decades of challenges. Then he looked at Catherine, seeing the future queen, the mother of his grandchildren, the woman who had brought stability and respect back to the monarchy. "I support my wife," Charles said finally, though his voice carried little conviction. "But I also believe in honoring our family commitments." "That's not an answer," Catherine pressed. "That's a politician's response to avoid making a hard choice." Camilla stepped closer to Catherine, and, for a moment, the Princess of Wales thought her stepmother-in-law might remove the necklace and end the conflict. Instead, Camilla's expression hardened further. "You want a clear answer?" Camilla said. "Here it is. I'm tired of living in the shadow of Diana's memory. I'm tired of being treated as a temporary placeholder until you become queen. I've earned the right to wear any piece of jewelry in the crown collection, and I don't need anyone's permission to exercise that right." The declaration hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Catherine realized that this confrontation had moved far beyond the immediate issue of the necklace. This was about power, position, and the fundamental question of hierarchy within the royal family. "And if your actions damage the monarchy?" Catherine asked. "If this public conflict undermines confidence in the crown?" The monarchy has survived much worse scandals than a disagreement about jewelry, Camilla replied. What it can't survive is the appearance that the queen is powerless within her own family. Catherine felt a moment of grudging respect for Camilla's position, even as she disagreed with her methods. There was truth in what she was saying about the challenges of being queen in Diana's shadow, about the difficulty of establishing authority while being constantly compared to an idealized memory. But Catherine also knew that yielding on this issue would set a precedent that could undermine her own position for years to come. If Camilla could simply claim Catherine's jewelry when she felt like making a statement, what else might she decide to appropriate? So what do you propose? Catherine asked. That we abandon all protocols? That everyone just takes whatever they want whenever they feel their position needs reinforcing? I propose that we acknowledge reality, Camilla replied. I'm queen now. That means something, or it should. And if it doesn't, then perhaps we need to reconsider how this family operates. Charles looked between the two women, seeing the battle lines being drawn more clearly than ever. This wasn't just about a necklace anymore. This was about the future structure of the monarchy, about whether tradition and protocol would yield to personal feelings and power dynamics. A knock on the door interrupted the tense standoff. James Morrison entered with an expression of urgent concern. Forgive the interruption, but there's been another development. The Prince of Wales has returned from his engagements and is requesting to see all three of you immediately. He's quite concerned about the media coverage. Catherine felt her heart sink. She had hoped to resolve this situation before William became involved, but clearly that was no longer possible. William's loyalty to her was absolute, but his intervention would escalate the conflict to a level that might cause permanent damage to family relationships. Where is he? Charles asked. In the throne room, Your Majesty. He's been monitoring the news coverage and social media reactions. The three family members looked at each other, each understanding that William's involvement changed the dynamic significantly. He was the heir to the throne, Catherine's husband, and Charles's son. His position gave him the authority to demand resolution, but also the power to make this conflict much worse. I think we should speak with him together, Catherine said. This has gone beyond a private family matter. Charles nodded, though Camilla looked less certain. Catherine could see her stepmother-in-law calculating the implications of facing William while still wearing the contested necklace. As they walked toward the throne room, Catherine found herself thinking about the institution they were all sworn to serve. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, and constitutional crises by maintaining unity and presenting a stable front to the public. But it had also evolved by adapting to changing circumstances and finding ways to honor both tradition and contemporary needs. The throne room doors were open, and they could see William standing with his back to them, looking out the tall windows toward the palace gates. Even from behind, Catherine could see the tension in his posture, the way he held his shoulders when he was struggling to control his anger. William turned as they entered, and Catherine saw immediately that her husband was furious. His face was composed, but she knew him well enough to recognize the signs of barely controlled emotion. I've spent the afternoon fielding calls from palace officials, royal correspondents, and constitutional experts, William said without preamble. Everyone wants to know if the royal family is having a crisis over jewelry, and, frankly, I'd like to know the same thing. His eyes moved to the necklace around Camilla's neck, and Catherine saw his jaw tighten. William had been the one to suggest giving the necklace to Catherine, had been present when Charles made the formal presentation. He understood its significance better than almost anyone. William, this is a family matter that got out of hand, Charles began, but his son cut him off. Father, with respect, this stopped being a private family matter the moment it hit social media and the news. Now, it's a constitutional issue about the stability of the crown. William moved closer to Camilla, his expression serious but respectful. Camilla, I need you to help me understand something. What message are you trying to send by wearing Catherine's necklace? The directness of the question caught Camilla off guard. She had prepared for anger or accusations, but William's approach was more challenging because it required her to articulate her motivations clearly. I'm sending the message that I'm queen, Camilla said, though her voice lacked some of its earlier defiance. That my position means something, that I'm not just a figurehead waiting for the next generation to take over. William nodded thoughtfully. I understand your frustration, and I respect your position. But let me ask you this. What happens to the monarchy if every time someone feels their position is questioned, they decide to ignore established protocols? The question forced Camilla to confront the broader implications of her actions. Catherine could see her stepmother-in-law struggling with the realization that her personal statement might have consequences beyond her immediate family. The protocols can be changed, Camilla said, though less certainly than before. They can, William agreed, through discussion, consultation, and family agreement, but not through unilateral action that creates public crises. Charles stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with his son taking charge of the situation. William, I appreciate your concern, but this is something your stepmother and I need to work out. William's expression hardened slightly as he turned to his father. Father, you've had all day to work this out, and instead, the situation has escalated to the point where the BBC is running special segments about royal family conflicts. The time for private family discussions has passed. Catherine watched her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. He was absolutely right about the situation requiring immediate resolution, but she also knew that his intervention would have lasting effects on family dynamics. What do you propose? Catherine asked quietly. William looked at her, and she could see the pain in his eyes. This was not a position he wanted to be in, but circumstances had forced him to act. I propose that we establish clear protocols for jewelry sharing that respect everyone's position while maintaining family harmony, William said. And I propose that those protocols be followed consistently, regardless of personal feelings or relationship dynamics. And if Queen Camilla chooses not to follow those protocols? Catherine asked, though she kept her voice neutral. William's answer was quiet but firm. Then, we'll have to consider what that means for her role in representing the crown. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. William was suggesting that Camilla's position as queen came with responsibilities, and that failing to meet those responsibilities could have consequences. Camilla looked around the room at the three people who held her future in their hands. Charles, torn between love and duty. Catherine, fighting for respect and protocol. And William, representing the future of the monarchy and the power to enforce its standards. Slowly, Camilla reached up and unclasped the necklace. The sapphires caught the light one final time as she held them out to Catherine. Perhaps, she said quietly, we should all think about what's truly important here. Catherine took the necklace, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. But as she looked at Camilla's face, she saw not defeat, but a kind of resigned dignity that made her stepmother-in-law seem more human than she ever had before. Thank you, Catherine said softly. And Camilla, we do need to talk about making sure you feel valued and respected. Just not like this. As the family stood together in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by portraits of monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices, they all understood that something fundamental had shifted in their relationships. The necklace had been returned, the immediate crisis resolved, but the underlying tensions and questions about power, position, and respect would require much more work to address. Outside the palace walls, the first evening news broadcasts were beginning, and royal correspondents were preparing to report on the day's events. But inside the throne room, the future king and queen, the current king and queen, stood together and began the difficult work of rebuilding trust and finding a way forward that honored both tradition and the complex emotions of a very modern royal family. The Queen Alexandra necklace would return to its place in Catherine's jewelry collection, but its brief journey around Camilla's neck had revealed truths about ambition, insecurity, and the delicate balance of power that would influence the monarchy for generations to come.